This is hell.
Sure, it would be great if the Green New Deal would solve all our problems and lead us into a world that is not the dystopian hellscape we're likely to encounter in our inevitable future of societal collapse. But it won't work if the Green New Deal itself actually contributes to climate change during its implementation. Here to give us the bad news on what we hope can be a very, very good thing, author and poet Jasper Bernes, who wrote the Commune Mag article Between the Devil and the Green New Deal. You can find the article at communemag.com, where Jasper is the managing editor. Welcome to This Is Hell, Jasper.
Hi, thanks for having me, Chuck.
You can find out more about Jasper at jasperbernes.net. That's BERNES.net. And you can follow Jasper on Twitter at Outside Agitator, which is another great Twitter handle. You describe how from space, the Bayan Obo mine in China, where 70% of the world's rare earth materials are extracted and refined, almost looks like a painting. The paisleys of the radioactive tailings ponds, miles-long concentrate, the hidden colors of the earth, material aquamarines and ochres of the sort of a painter might employ to flatter the rulers of a dying empire, which is a frightening picture. And although they look different in their devastation, it reminded me of memes on social media a few years ago comparing sites of tar sands mining to scenes of Mordor from Lord of the Rings. You add, to meet the demands of the Green New Deal, which proposes to convert the U.S. economy to zero-emissions renewable power by 2030, there will be a lot more of these mines gouged into the crust of the earth. What progress, if any, is being made in replacing our current energy sources with one that can create an equivalent amount of energy without contributing to climate change?
What progress?
Exactly.
I think that's difficult to assess. I mean, certainly the amount of renewable energy that's being generated in the United States and in other countries has increased, but so has the total amount of energy that's being used. So if you replace certain energy sources with renewables, but those other energy sources still continue to be used in greater amounts, then you really haven't done much. And so far, that's been largely the effect of the kind of increase of renewable energy, that it hasn't offset anthropogenic gas-emitting energy sources, but rather just perhaps allowed the use of those sources to increase less quickly. And that's not going to stop catastrophic global warming. At best, it might delay it a little bit.
To fight climate change, do we all need to just quit consuming as much energy as we do? Is the only way to actually fight climate change at all is to just simply quit our energy consumption?
More or less, yes. I mean, I'm not saying that we are all going to not consume any energy whatsoever, or that's a kind of reasonable projection or plan. But yes, there's no solution to the kind of crisis of global warming that doesn't involve a reduction of the amount of energy that each person is using. And that's certainly the case in kind of high energy consumption areas like the United States, where people are using, 6 or 8 times as much energy as people in the poorest countries. So perhaps for people in the poorest countries, we could have a transition where they were using more energy. But for those of us in the United States, we're going to have to find a way to use less energy. And so simply, adding in new renewable technologies, that's not going to cut it. And there's a lot of these fantasies about kind of technological solutions to this problem, free, clean energy, but those don't really seem anywhere on the horizon. If you look at the IPCC report, the kind of consensus of the world's scientists, they don't really give any credence to these kinds of technologies. They don't think that most of them are going to be available in the next, few decades.
So, to fight climate change, let me just get back to something else. Our economy and the innovations it creates depends upon, even demands energy consumption and growth to work. How dependent is our economic system then on consuming as much energy as possible and constantly consuming more in the form of growth for continued success? How dependent is our economy on the causes of climate change?
They're directly correlated. More or less, all economic growth has meant growth in per capita energy consumption. That's been consistent across the entire history of capitalism. And capitalism didn't really become a dynamic, um, self-generating system of constant growth until capitalists found these kinds of fossil fuel energy sources, chiefly coal. Right? It was coal that enabled capitalism to become this kind of machine, this automaton of constant growth. So, I think that it's unclear that you could have capitalism without constant growth, and it's also unclear that you can have constant growth without fossil fuels.
Do we have to end globalization to fight climate change? Because you write the renewable energy supply chain is a complicated hopscotch around the periodic table and around the world. To make a high-capacity solar panel, one might need copper from Chile, indium from Australia, gallium from China, and selenium from Germany. So do we have to end globalization in order to fight climate change? And can we fight climate change by ending global, would that, if we were fighting climate change, would that actually be globalized?
Well, I think it really depends what you mean by globalization. When people use that term, they're referring to a transformation of capitalism that's occurred over the past 30 years. And what that's about is not about bringing everybody closer together or kind of linking the fate of nations for some sort of reasons of peace and harmony, but really it's about allowing multinational corporations to go all over the world and find the cheapest labor possible, right? So the reason that so much of the stuff that we consume in the United States is made in China is not because it's more efficient to do it there, but because it's cheaper and you can make more profit. If you remove the profit imperative, it wouldn't really make sense to do things the way that we're doing them. It would be, it doesn't. If you paid everybody the same, it would be too expensive to make it in China, right? And it would be wasteful to ship things halfway across the world. And so, really outside of capitalism and the logics of capitalism, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do these things that way. And then when you think about trying to conserve energy and emit fewer greenhouse gases, it really doesn't make sense to ship things all over the world. Now, there are some things that are kind of scarce resources and that you can't get where you live. But that's not really what globalization is about in any way. I think that if we want to reorganize the economy and the way that we live in a way that makes sense, that isn't crazy, we're going to have to kind of break the link of these global markets, and we're going to have to find ways to kind of feed ourselves and make shelter and produce the things we need using less energy, and that means localizing a lot of production. But at the same time, I think that kind of process, to be successful, needs to be a global process, and you can still build connections between people living, thousands of miles away. And there can be another kind of globalization that's about kind of assistance and solidarity, communication, etc. So, I don't think, to answer your second question, I do not think that that it means in turn that we can just wall ourselves off from the world economy, and that's going to, on its own, fix the problem. That's absurd. And yes, I mean, you could also be incredibly wasteful as a kind of, autarkic economy that's turned away from the world. I don't really think that is a solution either. But then again, I don't think any countries are really capable of doing that. So, I think that's my sense of the connection between globalization and the problem of global warming.
You mentioned Emile Zola writing in the 19th century in Germinal, pretty much a critique of fossil fuel extractivism, a critique of coal mining. To what extent was there public debate and discussion about mass fossil fuel consumption from the very beginning? Did anyone predict not necessarily climate change, but inevitable environmental destruction? Because we're often given the sense that They were innocents who didn't know better, who were only trying to do the right thing for their children, for the next generation, a more wealthy, healthy, and less harsh world of automation and leisure. So, was there debate over fossil fuels from the beginning?
I don't. I'm not sure that I know that much about the kind of history of uh, coal use in the 19th century to really accurately answer that question. But I do know that coal made people's lives miserable from the beginning, both by kind of polluting cities and occasionally uh, filling them with so much smoke that people were getting sick. And of course, the coal mines themselves were miserable places, and people reacted to both of those kinds of conditions. Um, there were all kinds of worries in the 19th century about the kind of scarcity of various resources and the unsustainability of capitalism. I don't. I think that uh, Jevons notes that energy use is. He's a 19th century economist. Energy use increases with uh, economic growth and worries about what will happen when coal runs out. So, but beyond that, I'm not sure I know enough to really answer the question.
You write, monsters are products of the earth in classical mythology, children of Gaia, born from the caves and hunted down by a cruel race of civilizing sky gods. But in capitalism, what's monstrous is earth as animated by those civilizing energies. In exchange for these terrestrial treasures, used to power trains and ships and factories, a whole class of people is thrown into the pits. How much do you think the public understands, recognizes, and realizes that exchange and accepts it? Has there always been the same kind of unwritten agreement in a way?
Well, I think that I think it depends on where you live. If you live in West Virginia, you probably have a good sense of what it means to work in a coal mine. Although now coal miners are compensated much better than they were, and I think the conditions are better in some ways, but it's still dangerous work. But fewer and fewer people are working in these kinds of sectors because of automation and because there's been a kind of outsourcing of a lot of kind of mineral and extraction work. So I think a lot of people don't have any sense of what it means to work in a mine, historically or at present. But then if you live in a mining community, of course you do. So but a lot of the kind of mines and mining areas have been closed down, and coal is no longer being used the same kind of rate in the United States. So,
So,
yeah.
you write, energy is never clean. The infrastructure of the modern world is cast from molten grief. You're an excellent writer, Jasper. Do we actively delude ourselves? Do we actively delude ourselves into believing that our actions do not have a negative impact on the world? And to you, what does it say about a society that is in such kind of active denial, if you think it is active?
Well, I don't think that you can evaluate any action and conclude whether it's negative or positive, because you would have to be it's always a question of relative to what. And we don't know in advance the kind of the meaning or the effects of our actions in full. And that's what makes politics, right? Is that people do these things and they don't know whether the effects will be the effects that they intend. In fact, usually they're not the effects they intend. So, I'm not blaming people for being involved in a system that is violent at every level and every place. You have no choice, right? I drive a car, and because my life requires that I do so. So I think that it's not really a moral perspective. And in terms of awareness, I think that our awareness is limited, and that's because we live in these societies that are enormously complex, and they're also designed to kind of occlude the sources of violence, right? So there's not a lot done to make the world visible to us, because the way that the economy is organized is kind of predicated on you just doing your job in this one place. There's no attempt to make where you are within the system visible. I think a society that was truly free and truly equal would that would be a really important part of it, would be that it was transparent so that you understood what you were doing and the effects of what you were doing, and you were sort of connected to people, and you saw yourself as, connected to this whole social process. But there's no emphasis on that at all. And our society is incredibly technical and complex, so it's difficult to understand what's happening. I take great interest in trying to learn about how things work. That's the thing that I really enjoy in writing these pieces, is digging into the kind of technical characteristics of, say, the energy system. I find it really fascinating to understand how these processes function. I don't have a background in science or engineering or mathematics, but I think it's important to try as best I can to understand really how these things work, and whether certain adaptations or reconfigurations are possible.
Are you dismissing the Green New Deal, or, and I think this is really important because there's so much writing is like this nowadays, where people are saying, we're trying to start a conversation, whether it's on socialism or climate change or whatever the case is. We're trying to start a conversation. Green New Deal started a conversation. Do you feel like you are part of that conversation, the Green New Deal, or do you feel like you are dismissive of the Green New Deal in its entirety?
No, I'm definitely part of the conversation, and I hope that my article doesn't come off as dismissive. I think that a lot of people who are invested in the Green New Deal, they are sincere people, they are intelligent people, and in many cases, they want the same kinds of things that I do. And I think that's important to recognize. They are not in this world; they're enemies, but the people I'm engaging with are not my enemy, and I'm certainly not dismissing their action. But one of the things with the Green New Deal is that right now it's a policy proposal and a discussion, and so I think that it's fair game to really talk about whether it will work or not. I think my reaction would be very, very different if we had a massive social movement in the United States that were calling for something like a Green New Deal. But that's not what this is, right? This is a project that sort of originated within the nonprofit world as it intersects with elected politicians, and it is being kind of promoted by a whole network of uh, publishing initiatives and podcasts, etc. It's an idea, and I think ideas are fair game. It's worth asking, if they're the right ideas. I think that the hopeful take on it is that this is about kind of changing hearts and minds, and getting people to have some hope, that uh, that these problems are changeable. And I understand that, and I think that that work is important. But it seems to me that hitching that conversation to uh, a kind of policy initiative like this, and particularly a set of kind of electoral campaigns, is I worry about the effects of that. I worry that in fact it will make it harder to do the kinds of things that we need to do in order to really save our own lives and the lives of the people who are to come.
We are speaking with author and poet Jasper Bernes, who wrote the Commune Mag article, Between the Devil and the Green New Deal. You can find the article at communemag.com, where Jasper is the managing editor. He is the author of 2017's The Work of Art in the Age of Deindustrialization. He also has 2 books of poetry out, titled We Are Nothing and So Can You, and Stars Down. Find out more about Jasper at jasperbernes.net. That's BERNES.net. We recently spoke to sustainability scholar Jem Bendell, who no longer believes sustainability should be pursued, seeing the field as a failure. Instead, Jem says it's time to figure out how we will adapt to climate change. Can capitalism adapt to climate change? Can we make green new capitalism that would create a Green New Deal?
Mm. Well, I think that capitalism may adapt to climate change. I think the chance of capitalism surviving the 21st century is probably pretty low. And what seems more likely to me is that something will replace capitalism in climate change that is not the same time a kind of an emancipatory social form, but we'll have some other kind of class society organized through other principles. They may in fact be even uglier than what we have already. And but I think that I think that capitalism will adapt as climate change increases, but it will adapt not by mitigating the situation and improving everyone's lives and keeping everyone alive, but by kind of building walls and building fortresses for the rich, by engaging in kind of risky geoengineering and doing things like that. So one of the things I'm most worried about is I'm as worried about climate change happening and killing off most of our companion species on the planet and potentially endangering the lives of millions, maybe billions of people, so completely changing the planet. I'm as worried about that as I'm worried about a geoengineering response, because we don't control. Most people in this world have no control over what is done in their name, and it's not hard for a government to decide they're going to geoengineer and send up a bunch of rockets into space into the sky filled with sulfur, and start trying to control the temperature on the planet that way. And that, who knows what the consequences of that will be. So, I think that there are a lot of dangers beyond just climate change. The political consequences of it, are going to be quite severe. Unless we can come up with kind of revolutionary movement to counter those sorts of ruling class projects.
One last question for you, Jasper. I wish we could go longer, but unfortunately, our show is being truncated today due to special programming. I've only got about 60 other questions for you, so we could have wrapped this up in the next 3 hours. I'm sure.
You do this for 4 hours every Saturday?
Yep, for 4 hours, sir, without any commercial interruptions. Yeah, it's also suicidal. So you might want to think about that, too. We've been speaking with author and poet Jasper Bernes, who wrote the Commune Mag article, Between the Devil and the Green New Deal. Our final question for each and every one of our guests is called The Question from Hell. It's a question we might hate to ask, you might hate to answer. Our audience is going to hate your response. You write the new of the Green New Deal must express itself in language decidedly old, appearing to great-grandpa's vanished workerism and the graphic style of WPA posters. Is the problem with the Green New Deal not the green part, but the New Deal part? If we want the Green New Deal or something like its goals to succeed, do we need to take the New Deal out of the Green New Deal?
Well, I think that a lot of people who in response to criticisms of the New Deal part of the Green New Deal, they say, well, I didn't choose the language, I'm just working with what we have. But I do think that it's dangerous to kind of draw upon these historical examples without really understanding the context and to kind of misappropriate them as it were. I mean, the important thing that I would say is that the New Deal, that wasn't the demand of the era, right? The workers who were organizing in the 1930s, they were not calling for a New Deal. The New Deal was a response for the things that they were calling for, and I think it's really important to kind of to note that there was that back and forth between people struggling between mass movements and the government response to it. One of the problems with, I think, the New Deal as a demand is that it collapses that distance between movement and the state. And I'm really worried about the consequences of collapsing that distance. So I would say yes, in that sense, that turning the New Deal into a slogan or a demand is misguided. It would be better if we had a movement that was, that had demands such as decarbonize now, or something like that, and then kind of putting pressure on the state to do that and attempting to kind of decarbonize in its own way by blocking pipelines or kind of engaging in direct action. I think that's a more promising sort of political vision for our times.
Jasper, I really appreciate you being on the show. And like I said, we could have talked about this for another hour. It's a fantastic article. A lot of people are responding to it on social media, continuing that conversation that needs to be done around addressing climate change. So thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being on our show.
Thanks for having me, Chuck.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more hell, visit thisishell.com.